Okay, I'm just going to kick off with an intro, and then that will give a bit of time for participants to join us. And welcome to all of those joining us at class for this event today. Today we learn, and people would have seen that there's new labour market statistics out. Of course, there is a lag in the labour market statistics. They don't really always tell us what's happening at the moment. And the big issue that we're having right now, of course, is that because of the furlough scheme, the impacts of COVID-19 are likely to come in a much stronger sense over the autumn, as the furlough scheme is wound down quite quickly. But what we did see today in those statistics was a drop in paid employees of 650,000 people. So that was according to their HMRC PAYE record. So that's a drop of 2.2%. We know that the claimant count has gone up quite dramatically up to May, reaching 2.8 million. We know that vacancies have dropped quite dramatically, the biggest drop, I believe, on records. We know as well from the British Chamber of Commerce that this is really just the beginning. The new survey out from them found that 29% of businesses plan to make some redundancies over the next few months. This is a very frightening time in the labour market and for people, as they're not sure about if they're going to have their jobs in a few months' time, and where they will potentially be gaining employment if they are new to the labour market. We've also heard about stories, say, of British Airways, where, as well as redundancies, they are effectively trying to fire and rehire on much less lower conditions, working conditions. And there is a sense that many employers will be using that kind of tactic over the next few months. And of course, some of them are genuinely having trouble with demand, but some of this is also a cover to lower worker standards and workers' rights. And there is a real concern about growing precariousness and more people in zero-hour contracts as we go forward. This comes on top of some of the findings that we had ourselves in a report, Coronavirus and the Workers' Crisis, that we put out over 6 weeks ago now, which showed, of course, a massive reduction in working hours. But one of the things that really struck us in that report was just how uneven the impact of these cuts and working hours and jobs were, and it just seems like those on lower pay are being disproportionately affected. Almost 20% of those we surveyed in that report were not confident that they would have their jobs in 6 months' time. So that's about 6 million people. 1 in 3 are not able to make ends meet. Interestingly, because we do this labour market realities report every year, it wasn't that much different last year. So this is one of the things as well that we need to consider, that some of these problems are underlying issues that have been a problem for some time, that are only being made worse or being exposed by the coronavirus. I think one of the things that really struck me looking at those statistics, and you can have a look at the report, was because we looked over the last 10 years to do an appraisal of kind of 10 years of conservative-led governments. There were 3 trends that really worried us going forward, one of which is the inequality. The inequality, as I've said, about who is being most affected, and it does look as though those on the lowest incomes are, and especially actually young people as well. That there is increasing polarization in the labour market, meaning this is a long-term trend again. Over the last 30 years, we've had an increase in low-paid jobs, an increase in some graduate-level positions, and a fall in middle-level jobs. So this polarization within the labour market of who's valued and who's not. And we could see some of that also coming through in those early statistics. And of course, as I've mentioned, increasing precariousness, and more people in zero-hour contracts on low pay in very difficult situations. And so, you know, in the light of those problems, existing problems and heightened problems because of COVID-19, we would hope for a very robust action from the government. And whilst certainly the furlough scheme and the job retention scheme was welcomed, there is real concern that not enough and robust action is being taken. And last week, you know, it really did seem like quite a timid response, given how much worse we expect things to get. And when we were expecting a new deal, instead we got a meal deal, and that line I've taken from a Labour Party tweet, I should say. Very little in terms of targeted response to some of the sectors most affected. And it does feel like they're waiting and seeing, and that's a real concern for many sectors. We were just talking before we were open the call that the Institute for Fiscal Studies have found today that the 5.5 billion of extra, which they said was extra additional capital spending, is actually not additional. It's actually simply a reallocation of other funds. So there is a real concern about the way in which the government is treating a very, very serious crisis ahead of us. I think today we really want to get to the heart of what we expect over the next few months, but also what we need to demand and what we should be fighting for going forward. And we're very lucky to be joined by James Meadway, an economist and writer, by Geoff Tily, from the senior economist from the Trade Union Congress. We've got Professor Susan Himmelweit from the Women's Budget Group, Anneliese Dodds, and the Shadow Chancellor. Thank you for joining us. And of course, Mika, who's an energy economist and just recently had a paper out with TUC on what a Green New Deal or proper green investment could look like. So I'm just gonna let James give us his views on where we are and what we expect in the next few months, and just his views on what the summer statement last week, or the mini budget, where that really takes us. Thanks, James.
Okay. Thank you, Faiza, for the introduction, which laid out much of where we are in the sort of the immediate setting for this, and obviously picked up on some of the very good work that class has done around kind of perceptions and immediate responses to the crisis. I wanted, and thank you, of course, for the invite to speak. I wanted to, seeing as I'm going first, I wanted to sort of lay out some of the kind of the setting for where we are, I suppose. For what's happening, and I think Faiza was quite right, and to be honest, it's sort of obvious to everybody that last week's summer event, the fiscal event, the Rishi Sunak, one of, what is it, 4 that he's now had his moment on the stage to do his thing so far this year. It's always a great big temptation, if you're Chancellor of the Exchequer, to get as many of these things in a year as possible. George Osborne, at the drop of a hat, would try and sort of set up mini budgets and things, basically because you get a free chance to say whatever it is you want, potentially to hand out quite a lot of money, and of course, in the case of Rishi Sunak, produced quite a lot of weirdly personalised branding for what was supposed to be sort of Treasury government announcements. You can read whatever you like into that sort of thing. But the big picture on it is that it completely misses the big picture, that what you have is, yes, a very significant intervention over the last 3-4 months of the crisis really sort of hitting home in Britain, ahead of where the pandemic first sort of broke out in East Asia. That's 3-4 months of this crisis really hitting home, a very serious dislocation to economic life. Very significant amounts of spending, as people keep saying, the largest peacetime intervention, just in sort of cash terms, that has ever been made in British history, coming to around £190 billion worth of spending over this year. Exceptional levels of debt. I think the figures from ONS today were 574 billion of government debt additionally issued this year. The extraordinary thing of paying for close to 9 million people's 80% of their wages on the government payroll, and then additional support for various self-employed small businesses, this kind of thing. The extraordinary thing is that this is still a very long way short of what needs to happen, a very long way short of matching the scale of the crisis. And it's worth starting with this, because this is a crisis that is unique in the history of capitalism. There has never been anything in history that approaches this. It is unique in the scale of what's taken place, that, forget the great financial crisis, we're way beyond that. That's the 2008-9 crisis of a decade ago. That was very big. That involved very large government interventions, bailing out the banks, all this sort of thing. But we're way beyond that point. It's bigger, I would say, although we're in the early stages of this, than the Great Depression. Certainly on the raw numbers, the kind of scale of collapse in GDP, it's much, much bigger in Britain than anything we saw in the Great Depression. Britain had a relatively insulated Great Depression, largely because much of the economy was already depressed at that point. But the scale of collapse in GDP in Germany after the Wall Street crash of 25% or thereabouts, similar in the US, is kind of what we're experiencing at this point in time. But the bit that makes it so dramatic is that, unlike other peacetime crises of the kind that we've seen in the last, say, 150, 200 years or so, this isn't starting with a kind of financial shock. It's not starting like the great financial crisis with something going wrong in the financial system, which then feeds into the real economy. This is starting with a real shock. It's a shock in the real economy. It's a fundamental dislocation of how we live our lives. And how we work and where we work and the kind of works we perform. And because of that, because this shock is so fundamental, it bleeds out into everything else pretty rapidly. So then you stack up all the other problems, the problem of the collapse in demand. It's completely necessary in the case of Britain to impose a lockdown. We have had, and the government has had, a truly appalling crisis, as the really shockingly bad figures on infections and deaths show. But because that was so bad, you have to have quite a sharp lockdown on the top of it. And this is a completely necessary public health measure. And there shouldn't, by the way, be any attempts. And I think I'm pretty confident, actually, there's a broad consensus amongst economists on this, which is that the trade-off that sometimes gets talked up by, particularly elements, I would say, of the Conservative Party, is between, we've got to get the economy going, or we have to do public health. It's nonsensical. You have to get the public health thing right in order for the economy to function at all. Otherwise, you can see what happens if you start to release lockdown too early. You end up with a spike in infections. This is happening in US states. You can see it quite graphically in front of us, places like Florida, where you release the lockdown early, you get a spike in infections, you have to go back into lockdown. And there's a grave risk, of course, that what's happened here is that we are exactly releasing the lockdown too early, and we'll hit a spike and then have to go back into something like lockdown already. And already you can see sort of localized spikes that are the product, it seems very clear in the case of Leicester, of a poorly regulated, poorly established labour market. That if you look at the countries that have been most badly affected by this crisis, it runs contrary to what you might expect beforehand, which is basically richer, more developed countries you might anticipate would do better. That hasn't really played out at all. That the countries as broadly, so far at least, done better out of this are the ones that often have just introduced fairly quick, simple, but effective public health measures. You can think of New Zealand, which people talk about, but Kerala in India, the state in India, Vietnam is another one that springs to mind. You introduce these effective measures early on. It doesn't have to be a great technological fix or whatever. And you do that and you do it straight away, and you can come through this so far in a better shape than Britain has, or for that matter, the US, where the opposite approach has been taken. There's been a search for a big technological fix. There's been an attempt to try and run the economy much as it always has been, without, delaying basically measures for as long as possible. And you can see the impact of that. So the public health versus the economy trade-off doesn't play out. Because this is a fundamental crisis, we have to get the public health part of it right. And because it's fundamental, I think there's also the serious impact which is that we're only in the early stages of this. That whatever we see heading towards us is the playing out of the crisis, and the fact that even with, wave a magic wand and get a vaccine immediately, and it's immediately effective, and we have a way to produce and distribute the thing, and all of this happens, you're still looking at a fundamental change in how the economy is ordered. Now, how's that played out in Britain, I think, is that we've been, some of us anyway, have been insulated from the worst impacts of the crisis through the furlough scheme in particular. And what that has done is kind of preserve the economy in aspic, if you like. That it's sort of taken most of the existing inequalities we have, and at vast expense, pretty well kept them exactly the same. That you can see there's a section of people out there working who have had a relatively more pleasant experience in all this. That if you are able to work from home, okay, you can't go out because there's a whole load of things you can't do, but it's relatively better, significantly better really, than people who've had to carry on working and often working in unsafe conditions. If you think of what has been happening in factories in Leicester producing textiles, where demand has gone through the roof because it's producing for an online retailer. It's gone through the roof, and they've imposed or had to introduce longer working hours at below minimum wage in terrible conditions. You get a spike in infections. So there's a real dispersion of results from all this. You can see that immediately happening in the labour market. Looking ahead, as we start to move, and as the government tries to move us probably too quickly out of furlough, and I think other people will make the point, but it really is, there's no immediate reason to say we need to get out of furlough. Interest rates have been falling for a very long period of time for government. They're close to world historic lows for this government. They've even gone negative again just in the last week or so. There's no reason at this point in time to say we must rush to pay this back, we must rush to end furlough. That really the public health necessity should dominate considerations on this. But as we start to move out of furlough, exactly as Faiza said, you can start to see the dislocation in the labour market is starting to play through. And the challenge there is that this isn't just about, can we prop up demand? Can we do the big Keynesian thing of saying, can government spend a bit more? Or in the case of this government, can we get people spending a bit more? The answer, by the way, so far is actually not really, that people are still very wary about going back to the shops and spending, not unreasonably. There's still a very high rate of infections out there. That it's not just about getting demand to move, that there's going to be a reshaping, a reordering of how we work and where we work. And for some industries, airlines springs to mind, this is going to be quite radical. And the real question is, how do you manage that transition? How do you manage those changes for those industries, but right the way across the economy? And who bears the costs of making that change? And this, I think, is going to start to become not the financial costs, this pile of debt, which, as I said, with interest rates so low, even negative for government, that isn't the real problem. The real costs are, how do we get out of a situation where some kinds of work will not be able to be performed anymore, and other kinds of work will have to introduce extra measures to protect people? All of these things are costs. All of these things involve changes. How do we make that happen where we are going to do it fairly and evenly across the economy, and transfer the costs of that onto the people really with the broadest shoulders? That's a fundamental sort of economic justice issue that I think we're going to start see playing out there. And that, I think, it's...
Sorry, just because you're coming to the end of your time, I'm trying to be a bit stricter. Go on, say...
No, don't worry, I'll just wrap up on this. So that's the fundamental question that I think we have to deal with. You can see already Labour, I think, is correct in saying that it needs to be a sectoral approach. I think that needs developing from this point and getting some of the detail about what it means to change how people work, perhaps talking about short-time working, for example, and introducing mechanisms even through the furlough system to start to bring that in. But as long as we start from the point of view that this is a fundamental change in how we work and how we're going to go forward and change what happens in the future, we'll be in a better place than thinking we can just spend a bit more money or magic up a vaccine and all of this will go away and everything will go back to some normal period in the past.
Thanks, James. Just to say to people that you can leave questions in the Q&A, and I'll come back to speakers with some of those at the end. I guess, James, one of the things that you reminded me of is what it felt like last week with the summer statement is that Rishi Sunak and the Tories think that we effectively just need some sticking plasters and we can go back to the same economic model. And they haven't realised how the fallout from COVID-19 and the fallout, the economic shock of it, means that certain structural underlying problems and changes are going to be sped up. And so we still don't have a proper industrial strategy. I mean, I thought it was interesting that they reintroduced essentially the Labour's Future Jobs Fund, which was a 2009 programme, which is the 6 months programme for young people, which on its own is not a bad thing. Of course, there's a lot of young people out of work and you need to put them in good additional jobs. And the problem is, of course, is what happens at the end of that 6 months. It should be a stepping stone into careers, into well-paid jobs, but there was nothing announced that really helps with that longer term change and shift and good job creation that we need in the economy. So with that, I'm going to come over to Geoff, who's the senior economist at TUC. Of course, at TUC, you've had oversight of all the sectors and what's going on. So it'd be interesting to hear from you, Geoff, about what patterns are emerging and what policies TUC are advocating at this time. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Faiza, and thank you for inviting me to join this excellent panel. I hope my Zoom holds out. I want to make 2 points. First, I want to talk about the risk of mass unemployment and the TUC position. And then I want to talk about how we motivate this position, in part by looking at the lessons from the Attlee government. So as has been said, the labour market statistics are full of danger signals, but for various reasons, the headline figures haven't been greatly impacted. And Faiza's talked about the most obvious measures, the 650,000 off payrolls, the sharp decline in hours worked, and the record low in vacancies. A lot of official commentators talk about a V-shaped recovery, but I'm greatly sceptical that a V-shaped recovery will happen by magic. Outside official figures, the pace and scale of redundancy announcements is truly alarming. I'm not going to pretend I know which of the terrifying unemployment forecasts will be right. But the one thing I do know is that what's next for workers depends on the government, which must shift its focus from rescue to recovery, or more directly, from protecting jobs to promoting jobs. While the TUC has broadly supported the Chancellor's approach to the protection of jobs, his approach to promoting jobs falls far short. Some initiatives like Kickstart went some way to meet our call for a jobs guarantee, but we should be way beyond gimmicks like Eat Out to help out. We want a National Recovery Council with unions, industry and government working together. And we have called for a sectoral approach to end the lockdown, not least for the hardest hit sectors like retail and aviation. The Chancellor seemed to me to cut a very different figure even the day after the budget, when he was confronted by redundancies across Boots, John Lewis, Burger King and General Electric. Our basic and simple argument is that we have to work our way out of recession. The government can and must create jobs through public investment in new homes, in childcare, in faster broadband, in better transport, and of course in the activities that will help us to address climate change. And it must invest in all public services, starting with filling the 200,000 vacancies in the NHS and social care and addressing pay for key workers. Specifically, and I suspect we will hear about this later, we have outlined an 85 billion green investment plan that would mean 1.24 million jobs. In our A Better Recovery report, we make comparisons with the Attlee government, in part to mark the imminent 75th anniversary, but more substantially because we think the comparison is a right one. In spite of public debt at 250% of GDP, they implemented the most important policy programme in Britain's history. As we all know, they created the NHS, set up social security, built new homes and new towns, they supported the arts, they nationalised the Bank of England, and they nationalised other industrial monopolies. They did so by focusing on jobs. They understood that the condition of the public finances was a consequence of the strength of the economy and the labour market, rather than the other way around. Alongside the report, we published analysis of all the economic recoveries over the past century. The Attlee recovery was top of the league for GDP growth, excluding the recovery that included the Second World War. Attlee also achieved the largest reduction in public debt ratio by far. We set these results in contrast to the austerity policies of the past decade. Osborne and his successors not only presided over the worst recovery for GDP growth, but also the worst performance for the public debt. And I do know it's not about growth, but I think it okay to judge Attlee on the terms of his modern rivals. So empirically, the outcomes are unequivocal. But I want to talk a little more about the logic of their approach, which also overlaps with some of the more detailed discussion in the Paying for It chapter of our report. The Labour Party Manifesto of 1945 was a succinct but sophisticated document. Under the heading Jobs for All, they asked the question, what will the Labour Party do? The answer, and I quote, first, the whole of the national resources in land, material and labour must be fully employed. Production must be raised to the highest level and related to purchasing power. Overproduction is not the cause of depression and unemployment. It is underconsumption that is responsible. That's the end of the quote.
No. Oh no, Geoff, I think you've been paused, stuck in the middle of your, I don't think he realizes. All right, Geoff, are you back?
Yeah, I'll get rid of the video because it might save a bit of energy. Where was I? Had I started talking about the Labour Party Manifesto?
Yes.
It
was like the last 10 seconds of what, yeah.
Okay, so there was this quote about using the whole of the national resources.
Yeah, you said that, yeah.
Okay, and then I said the context was the Great Depression. In order to resist calls for expansionary and progressive policies, certain economists in the 1930s had promoted a theory of overproduction. Their idea was that the economy had caved in because it was producing so much. From the perspective of those that had very little, this was laughable. Yet today we seem to confront a new variant of the same doctrine. Today we are told production is deficient relative to borderline excessive purchasing power, though economics is less coarse today, and the doctrine is dressed up in the jargon of natural rates, of near zero output gaps, of tight capacity, and the new in vogue phrase, scarring. But to put it in plain language, this time Labour is told that it is seeking to have more than its abilities allow. I think this is as misleading and toxic as the last time, and another inversion of reality. What Labour saw then is the same now. Purchasing power is deficient relative to production. And this explains the threat over the past decades from private debt. Firms are in debt because they are unable to sell, households because they can't afford to buy. The analysis also makes obvious the flaw with austerity. You don't resolve inadequate purchasing power by pressing down on wages and government consumption. You, of course, exacerbate the problem, and hence private debt continues to expand to new peaks. And of course, there was everything wrong even before the pandemic hit. The immediate necessity is to expand purchasing power in every way we can. But the fundamental lesson is that the system did not fail over the late 2000s in the Great Recession because it was operating beyond its potential. The present is not defined by what was happening ahead of the crisis. Aptly proved what had happened in the past had no bearing on what might be in the future. We should operate on the same basis again. We can and must build back better to the new economy that we all want. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Geoff. There's actually a question that actually might be helpful for you to answer from Mike Curtis. I don't know if you can see it as well, but I'll read it out, which is, why is the government selling gilts mistakenly called borrowing? This should only be necessary to take money out of an overheating economy, but with mass unemployment, there's obviously a lot of slack in the economy. Can you see it? Do you want to answer it? Sorry, you're on mute.
Could you repeat it? Sorry.
Yes. Why is the government selling gilts? This should only be necessary to take money out of an overheating economy, but with mass unemployment, there is obviously a lot of slack in the economy and zero chance of inflation. So the government can just spend almost as much as it wants.
I'm not sure I quite get the question.
Yeah, sorry.
I think the government is selling gilts because it has a very large deficit at the moment, much larger than planned. Obviously, it's a kind of peculiar sale of gilts because the Bank of England are basically buying them all. You know, the increase in borrowing pretty much exactly corresponds to the amount of gilts that the Bank of England are buying. I mean, maybe the questioner has in his mind or her mind, I don't know, the idea that there is, as some might say, there isn't really any limit to the amount of borrowing the Treasury can do because it can issue gilts and the Bank of England can buy them. And I might have some sympathy with that argument at the moment.
Yeah, James is just saying, James, I don't know if you want to come in on that, just say something about why we're not, maybe it's more of a question on why we're not focusing more on monetary tools. Do you want to say something on that?
I could do. I suppose there's not much to be said, which is that the issue with financing government spending that needs to happen at the minute through selling gilts, in other words, through borrowing, is that it is so ludicrously cheap, you know, to the point of being negative interest rates on at least some of those gilts. In other words, people are paying the government to borrow money. That there is very, very little incentive to introduce any other more unusual forms of financing. Now, that doesn't mean that, as the Bank of England has said, and as there seems to be a bit of a consensus, that monetary financing, in other words, using the capacity of the Bank of England to issue money directly to pay for government spending, that might be something you want to do down the line. But there's little reason to do it with interest rates as exceptionally low as they are at this point in time. So it's just easier to use the mechanisms that's already there. It introduces fewer complications elsewhere. It doesn't mean to say that you might not want to do something else further on, but for now it looks like this is the best and quickest and easiest way to get that spending in place.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the things that's really coming up is people are realizing, you know, as the government spends more money, which is something that they directly accused the Labour of bankrupting the economy before, is that these are tools that you use in these times when you need to expand public funding. There's a question, Geoff, to you from Don. I guess it's a general question. You've spoken about the macro economy, but the question is, what do you see is calling for to resist employers using the crisis to shake out staff and rewrite employment contracts? So what specifically do you see is doing, and I guess the trade union movement is doing at this time to block dodgy employer behaviour?
I mean, I'm sure different unions have different approaches, but that is the raison d'etre of trade unions, is to try and stop employers taking dodgy approaches. I'm sure they're appealing to companies, you know, in the usual way through the usual negotiations. But fundamentally, it's why we think that the government has to take a sectoral approach, and it has to intervene in these sectors, and particularly the sectors that are hardest hit, and provide some subsidies and develop some plans in combination with unions, with employers and government, to try and see a way out the other side. I don't, you know, to get immediately into sort of industrial stress in industries is absolutely not what we want to do, which is why we think the government needs to take a more interventionist approach and needs to make more money available to sort of facilitate that approach.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting as well that quite a few trade unions have said to class, of course, we are funded by many trade unions, that the government, at least in the beginning, was interested in hearing from them. Do you still feel that TUC is able to have a conversation with Treasury? Is that door still open? Are you still able to push in the way that there was that initial push when lockdown first happened?
I think the door is open, and I think that the Treasury and other organisations have valued our contributions. You know, we're now pushing hard for a sectoral approach, and so far, you know, that doesn't seem to be the direction they're taking in. They're going in, but I think, as you said at the start, you know, this idea that they're taking a wait and see approach. They're operating under the sort of delusion that things might get better automatically. But I think as soon as they start going badly off track, then they'll definitely be knocking on the door again. I don't think that's a fantasy.
Okay, thanks, Geoff. I know Susan, you're meant to be next, but I'm going to come to Anneliese because I know you need to go at 8, and I want to give people the opportunity to ask questions. So, of course, Anneliese, you've been there, hearing what's happening in government and their response. And I think the point that Geoff made there, that when the Treasury gets desperate and they don't know what to do, they suddenly do have their ears open to trade unions and people that they don't often listen to. But it'd be really good to get your views on where we are on government policy and what policies Labour is advocating to build a new normal. And in fact, if that's really the headline aim of Labour Party policy.
Brilliant. Well, look, thanks very much indeed for inviting me to this discussion. I'm really, really sorry that I've got to leave early, particularly if I'm going to end up missing what Sue's got to say as well. I've got to put the kids to bed, I'm afraid. In fact, one of those, what's been described as the mother load during this crisis is quite extreme tonight. So I'm really, really sorry about that. And, you know, as ever, please do, if, you know, anybody who's part of this event who wants to raise anything with me, please do contact me directly if I'm not able to answer any questions. I also agreed with just about every single thing that the previous speakers have said, so I'm not going to repeat it again, but I suppose I wanted to focus in a little bit on where I think the kind of core elements are of what look set to be failures in government policy in dealing with this crisis, and where I think we need to make changes and do that very, very rapidly. The first area where I think there's a misunderstanding at the heart of government is around the nature of this crisis in terms of its impact on employment generally. And I think, I mean, obviously Labour, we were calling for a Future Jobs Fund style programme, a so-called active labour market programme, particularly focused on young workers. I mean, we know the impact that unemployment has on those young workers for their lifetime earnings, and the kind of impact that can have more broadly for, you know, for them and for our economy as a whole. So we did want to see that kind of active labour market policy being put into place. But in and of itself, unless it's very, very strongly targeted and carefully targeted, we do run risks, I think, of a situation where you could see substitutions of different forms of workers through that kind of a programme, and really very significant impacts from withdrawing the furlough scheme, of course, and the self-employed scheme at the same rate, when you have a very, very sluggish rate of new job production. And I think here it feels to me like the government's a little bit looking at the previous global financial crisis, where obviously it had a very significant impact, or rather some of the measures taken from 2010 onwards had a significant impact on people's living standards, you know, very, very sluggish wage growth over time, obviously very low uptake in investment, both private and public, from particularly from 2010 onwards. But we didn't see that impact on unemployment from that crisis. But of course, many of the jobs actually that came in during that, you know, after that crisis are precisely the ones which are being knocked out by the social distancing impacts of this one. So I think that to me, government's failing to get a grasp of that fact, the fact that we do have such low levels of vacancy coming through. It looks like we have a particularly major issue with this compared to many other countries. I mean, the rate of vacancies in France and Poland, for example, as I understand it, is already getting back to where it was before this crisis. That's not the case in the UK. Of course, there's then also the fact that whatever vacancies may be created, I'll come back to that point later in a minute, that the vacancies that may be created may well not be those which are suitable for people who are becoming unemployed at this time. So while we welcome the active labour market policies that have been introduced, and obviously additional DWP staff, I mean, bit of a no-brainer, doesn't backfill what's been cut since 2010, but you know, at least a bit more support there. We do welcome that, but in and of itself, unless there's that really strong focus on both retaining people's connection to the labour market with a particular employer through a more targeted furlough scheme and self-employed scheme, with short hours working, etc. schemes, or there's investment going in to stimulate job creation, then we're going to have a very, very prolonged unemployment situation. And, you know, I agree with others' characterisation of this. I think we unfortunately look set to have really quite sustained unemployment for quite a long period of time. It's not going to be soaked up in the way that occurred, I don't think, from 2010 onwards, for the reasons that I mentioned. So what needs to be done to change this? Well, first of all, and many others have said it more eloquently than I could have done, but there needs to be a recognition this is a sectoral crisis. That means removing the furlough scheme, the self-employed scheme, from all workers at exactly the same rate without any alternative in many cases is simply going to produce additional unemployment. That's all that it can do. We're already seeing that happening, unfortunately. And I predict very, very sadly that, you know, 45 days before every other change that's coming into those support packages, we will see by then redundancy consultations having been announced by major employers as well. It's not a sensible approach to take. Now, the Conservatives say that they will stick to that one-size-fits-all approach because they don't want to, in inverted commas, pick winners. Well, I mean, to an extent, they've crossed that Rubicon already because they've introduced some sector-specific demand measures. But in addition, you know, it seems completely knocked out of the park, that argument, by the fact that this is a crisis which has created losers. It's created losers by necessity because of the social distancing measures that have had to go in. That means you have to have a sectoral approach to this. So they need to need to ensure that they have a plan for those support packages, one that also will be able to fit with potentially additional local lockdowns when they might come in, or a more generalised lockdown potentially. I mean, we all hope there won't be one, but if there is one in winter, having that long-term strategy. But then we do also need, as I said before, investment in farms that will actually drive sustainable job creation, stimulate that where it's needed. Now, it's been frustrating. This has again been part of a general approach from the Conservative government, that they've not been willing to apply conditions on the investment that they have announced. I mean, it was the same with the furlough scheme as well. It didn't apply the condition that it had to be tied to employment, etc. In the future, as we've seen with BA. But with the investment they have announced, and you're absolutely right, Faiza, you know, lots of it is just pre-announced projects that have been kind of warmed up again, but they haven't tied those even to sustained additional local employment, upskilling, etc. in different areas. That means that we could see a very similar thing to what we've seen with for example, the public health response from government, which is a very centralised approach, one which involves potentially, you know, very, very major firms that don't develop local economic capacity. Of course, we haven't seen conditions being applied around the drive to net zero either, something that obviously I've repeatedly called for. We also haven't seen a focus from government on investment in those sectors where we know some additional funding would lead to potentially much, much more resilience and additional productivity. And I'm sure that Susan will talk about this, but I think that particularly applies to social care. You know, funding and promoting productivity in that sector would have a very significant impact on workers there, as well as, of course, on the, huge numbers of extremely vulnerable people who use those social care services. Same applies to local authorities. You know, local authorities are being required to make sure different local areas are safe for consumers, and yet they could be forced to cut their workforces by a fifth over a year if existing cuts go ahead. But I just want to finish, and the kind of elephant in the room around all of this, and a number of speakers kind of touched on this, is the fact that we can't separate, as has been mentioned, the economy from the public health response. And that in the UK has been so slow, it continues to be so weak, that that's having a massive impact on people's confidence to go into different businesses. And that then is having that knock-on impact on demand. There is bound to be a structural impact on demand from this, because there will be some people who will be nervous, even if there's a very, very effective test, track and isolate system in operation. I can understand that, but we are so far away from that situation currently that we really need to get that system right. It's absolutely critical. That is far more important than a meal deal. You know, if people feel confident to go back into businesses, it will make much, much more of a difference. So yeah, really, really pleased to be a part of this discussion. Again, sorry that I'm going to have to leave in 15 minutes. I do apologise.
I just wanted to actually come back. There's a couple of questions, but I just wanted to come back and release on a couple of things. Thank you so much. It's really helpful to get your insight. I guess one of the things is what policies you would have wanted to see last week, and someone's put it as a question about the level of unemployment around young people, if this is an opportunity to upskill young people. I was on a call earlier on in the week, or an event, online event with UCU, where they've launched a big campaign around funding for education. And one of the things I was thinking about last week is I so wish that they'd actually issued, instead of meal vouchers, education vouchers, so that people could take this time to perhaps go back and study. And if there's things, I know that, you know, there's this big thing about not announcing new policies, etc. But I guess from your perspective, what are the things that you really would have wanted to see last week?
Sorry, perhaps I was being a little too oblique, but to be very, very explicit about them. I mean, first of all, active labour market policies that will actually work and that won't just substitute existing workers. So that means having, for example, you know, if this Kickstarter scheme is going to be in place, making sure that there's strong engagement of trade unions, local authorities, third sector, that it really is assessed in terms of whether it's generating additional opportunities or not. Secondly, you know, repeatedly I've called for government to focus on retaining particularly young people in education and training. It's a cost-effective way of keeping people out of the pool of the unemployed. Then secondly, preventing unemployment in the first place as well, through having that sectorally differentiated approach to supporting wages. I think that's really, really important. Government's not willing to do that, but I think it is necessary. It's what other countries have been doing. We should learn from them. And then, of course, finally, supporting that job creation through, both in terms of scale and in terms of focus, the investment programme that we need. So that means not just reheated announcements. Again, it means learning from what other countries are doing on this. The Conservative government's plans around green investment, for example, were only around the size of Germany's investment in just one technology, hydrogen. There's so much more that we can do in that place, also imposing conditions on investment to make sure it generates the outcomes that we need. And also, as I said, investing in those sectors where it would make a real difference to employment outcomes. So I think that's quite a lot the government really should be doing, and I think it would make a big difference if they took that on board.
Great, thanks, Anneliese. I'm just going to come to Sue now, and I should say that unfortunately Roger McKenzie couldn't make the call today. Roger McKenzie is the Deputy General Secretary, I believe, at Unison, and we really wanted to give him a bit of an oversight, give us an oversight of what's happening in the care sector. Now, I can't do that. Sue knows lots about the care sector, but Roger, of course, has been organising at the grassroots for a very long time. But one of the things I do want to emphasise in the middle of this call, which is something that he was going to talk about, was really the disproportionate impact on Black, Asian, minority ethnic populations in this country. And we see that in terms of public health, and we see that in terms of death, not because of race, but because of racism and the way in which certain people find themselves on the front line, the multi-ethnic working class, and not the white working class, because the working class is multi-ethnic. And we found that where jobs are going, there's this double-edged sword for the working class, that on the one hand, they are the most likely to lose the jobs, and then on the other hand, they also are disproportionately on the front line. So it's really a very difficult time to be a working class person in this country. So I just want to highlight that fact as we go in to talk to Sue in particular around the care sector. And I've been lucky enough to be on some calls with Sue recently with the Women's Budget Group, because there's been a gender commission, and actually the findings in that work couldn't come at a better time, given everything that's happened to the care sector, and how much has been exposed, something we've known about for a long time, but how much has been exposed in terms of how workers are treated in that sector, how workers are paid, lack of protective equipment. I mean, it's all really come out. So Sue's going to talk to us about a care-led recovery. Thank you. Oh, Sue, you're still on mute.
Still am I? Hang on.
Great. Yeah, you're fine now.
Okay. All right. Well, I was also asked to talk a little bit about the effects on women, so I'm just going to give you a brief rundown on that. I think things that most people will have picked up from the news, but women are more likely to be key workers, and then more likely to be particularly in the high exposure jobs, and even more so BME women, and particularly in low paid work. And there's a really shocking statistics that I heard, which was that 98% of the 1 million key workers who are in particularly high exposure jobs, who were paid less than 60% of the median average wages, are women. So effectively, all the poorly paid workers who are key workers in high exposure jobs are women. On the other hand, women are also more likely to work in the sectors that were locked down. And it's especially young women. So hospitality, tourism, and retail are all sectors dominated by women, who are likely now to be particularly badly hit by redundancies. And on top of that, women may also have been less likely to be able to work from home than men. So only 1 in 10 low-paid workers could work from home, but 69% of low-paid workers are women. So if you put that together with something that we have now, amazingly, thanks to the Institute of Fiscal Studies, some rather good figures on, that women are doing far more childcare under lockdown than men. 50% more of the unpaid work in households than mothers are doing than fathers. And they also tend to be interrupted in more of their paid work hours than fathers. I remember a call on which I was on where Anneliese had a very charming little girl come and talk to her in the middle of her talk. But fathers are in fact doing more than they did do. So maybe that, I'm not sure how this will work out. Mothers' working hours have in fact reduced far more than fathers. And this might get worse in the summer holidays because there are even more limited formal and of course now informal childcare options, since older grandparents may not be so available. So all this is likely to increase women's risk of being made redundant, particularly as employers are beginning to have to contribute to the furlough scheme, but also as it comes to an end. But women may be less productive workers because basically they've often been trying to do 2 or more jobs at once, both looking after children and doing their normal job. This has had the pandemic has also had very bad effects on the care sector itself. So a quarter of nurseries now, childcare centres now report that they're not likely to financially survive the year. And that comes down to about 150,000 childcare places. And of course, most of the people that will lose jobs in that sector will be women. Social care providers are also facing decreased demand, partly due to justified fears about contagion, and also, of course, due to the number of people who have died in them. And again, many may not survive financially because they're not only facing decreased demand, but they've had substantially increased costs during the pandemic for which they have not been adequately compensated. So what this will lead to is a shortage of care for those who need it, and among the women and among the elderly, that is in fact mainly women, but certainly a huge number of job losses for women who work in the sector. So all this risks setting back gender equality by decades, because it will prevent those who take on the caring responsibilities, so more likely to be women, returning to work. So women become more vulnerable to job losses and poverty, and risks them returning to situations of economic dependency with poor consequences for the future. So in the Women's Budget Group, we argue that what's happened in the pandemic is basically to expose and exacerbate a crisis that was already existing in the UK in care. I think it's fairly well known that there's one in social care, but also in childcare. UK parents pay the highest childcare costs in Europe, and in fact, the second highest in the world. We really need actually investment directly in care to transform our broken care system. And so this is why we're calling for a care-led recovery programme to transform that system. And what we can also show is that it's an excellent way to stimulate employment, and in doing so, reduce the gender employment. And it's a very good way of building back better as the UK comes out of lockdown. Compared with investment in construction, which is the normal outlet for stimulus spending, even most of what's talked about as Green New Deal spending is actually forms of construction. But any investment in care creates 2.7 times as many jobs as an equivalent spending in construction. And this is because you need to look at not only the directly created jobs, but those that are indirectly created in the industries that supply any industry, and then the induced jobs that are created by the improved wages of those, the improved incomes of those who take the jobs. And if we look at the ratio of jobs created by care or construction, you get 10% more for men, even within care, by investing in care. And that's because so many more jobs are created overall through investment in care. And you get 6.3 times as many for women. So investment in care reduces the gender employment gap, while investment in construction increases it, which means actually that alongside any investment in construction program, you really need some mitigating measures in order to do something about the fact that it's going to worsen inequality overall. Investment in care also actually results in more being repaid to the Treasury in income taxes and VAT. So if you look at the difference in jobs generated by the net spending involved, it's even higher between care and construction. So what would we need to do to get a better care system? Well, first of all, we need a greater proportion of our total employment working in the care sector. We just don't have enough people working in that sector. For that, we would need care workers to be better paid and trained and have a proper career structure. So if, like some Scandinavian countries, the UK had 10% of its total employment in care, it's not a huge number. Even in Scandinavia, the vast majority of care is done unpaid after all. But if we had 10% of our employment in care, and that we ensured that the work
Oh no. This is classic move. Anneliese, I know you need to go, so I'm just going to
pay care workers are paid at least the real living wage.
Wait, Sue, you kind of got stuck for a second.
Stuck, have I? I didn't realise that.
Got stuck for 1 second. I'm just going to give this an opportunity just to say thank you and goodbye to Anneliese. I guess one of the things just quickly, before you go, if you want to say anything, if you want to come back on that care argument there, or if there's anything you want to add. I mean, I guess one of the things that really strikes me is that whenever I hear Sue give this argument, it's such a no-brainer. Like, what are the blocks in government from really stopping this from happening?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I think that there seems to be some kind of a strange inability to see the necessity for investment in care. And certainly it's something that I've been trying to highlight repeatedly and, really share the analysis that's being set out there. Absolutely. And, so thanks again so much, everybody. Really sorry about this. I'm sure the rest of the discussion will be a really stimulating one. So thanks a lot, everyone. Take care now.
Thank you. Bye. Go on, Sue, carry on, sorry.
So did I fade out, or was because I got a little message on my thing that
the last kind of 10 seconds of what you were saying we didn't hear, so you'd given like... Did
I mention Scandinavia?
Yes,
yeah. Okay. So if we were trying to emulate Scandinavia, we would be spending something like 2.3% of our GDP, a net spending of that, and we would generate over 2 million jobs in the economy as a whole. So not all in care, but it would generate 2 million jobs overall. We would raise the overall employment rate by more than 5 percentage points, which is roughly half of what some of the predictions of the level of unemployment would be, but who knows about the level of unemployment. And we would reduce the gender employment gap by 4 percentage points. And that's a significant change towards more equality. And even if we then started paying care workers better to reflect improved training through investing in care, in the quality of care, we'd still generate more than twice as many jobs as the same net spending on construction. So we would argue that a care-led recovery would transform care services for those who need them, generate significant employment, reduce the gender employment gap, but still create lots of jobs for men. It would be an investment in the future through creating a healthier, better educated and more productive population, and through an investment also in preventing greater needs in the future. And above all, it would also be sustainable, because rather than producing more things, what we're actually all going to have to be spending our time doing is caring for each other more and learning how to do so better in the future.
Great, thanks, Sue. There's someone that actually asked a question really related to that last point you made, which is around if this is an opportunity to move away from individualism to a kind of more of a collective and caring type of economy, and it certainly feels that way. I guess asking the question I asked Anneliese, I mean, I've heard you, and you must be frustrated, you know, I've heard you make this argument, you've worked on this issue for many years. It really is a no-brainer. I mean, part of the reason perhaps that we don't get the changes that we need to see in the care sector is because it is disproportionately women, migrant women, and people, women of color. I think that's part of the reason, because they're not a population that are prioritized. But I just wonder what you think are the key blocks to this happening. Is it privatization of the care sector, for instance?
Well, I don't know that privatization is a key block to it happening. I think privatization is one of the problems with our care sector, and one of the things that needs basically undoing anyway. So this, you know, a sizable investment in public sector care would be a good way to do that. I think the reason that people sort of dismiss investment in care is it's something that they don't really believe should cost that much. That it's the only industry in the whole economy that's always talked about in how can you prevent it costing so much. The cost containment has been the mantra of every single report there's ever been on care, rather than a focus on the quality of what people get from it, the work and the conditions of workers. I think one of the things that makes the case slightly easier now is people are actually concerned about how sustainable investment is. And when we're talking about investment in care, of course, we are talking about recurrent expenditure. It's not a one-off. It's not like building a single bridge. It's more like comparison with a program of bridge building. But people are now talking in terms.
Oh no, we've lost you again, Sue. I might have to come back to you at the end.
In terms of, for example, with the green jobs, that one of the good things are that it's a program that will.
Okay, sorry, Sue, we lost you for a
second.
I think it's an opportunity though to bring in Mika, and you know, we often organise these panels, and I always think if only all of these people were like running government. And Mika's been doing a lot of work on, of course, a green industrial revolution. And if only we could combine that care and green-led recovery, right? That's the ultimate thing to do right now. It's really a no-brainer, and it kind of creates the jobs. It sorts out sustainability. It does something about the care sector, which has just been one of the biggest failures of the government response, and has really highlighted just all of the problems there. And like you say, it's not just social care, it's childcare as well. And we know that lots of small childcare organisations say they're always on the brink of going bust. It's not a sustainable care system. So coming to you, Mika, if you want to just like round us up and just break down for us what we should be doing and why now is the time to do it. Thank you.
Right, cool. Everything, what we should be doing, why now the time is. So I guess there's been lots of talk about a green recovery. Even Boris was promising it, told us that Rishi would tell us how it was going to be delivered, but I think a lot of us are still waiting to hear how they are going to deliver it. There's important questions around to what extent do climate measures help recover from the economic crisis and the jobs crisis that COVID has created, and also which green things really do help and which ones don't, because often it's assumed that any green investment will be good economically and will create all the right types of jobs, and that's not necessarily the case. So I did a chunk of work recently as transition economics. We did some modelling for the Scottish TUC, for the TUC, and also the Welsh TUC, but that bit isn't published yet. And I put a link into the chat with some slides that I'm obviously not showing you, but people can look at them and download them, and those run alongside what I'm saying, and they also include a link to the data that was published by both the Scottish TUC and the UK TUC. Now, we only, in our analysis, we only examined possible physical infrastructure investments that were one-off capital spending. we made the point in the longer document that this didn't include the necessary investment into care, work, and health that is obviously essential, and that the physical construction stuff, particularly, it's not all construction, but that stuff can only be part of a recovery package. I think it's I mean, as someone whose baby is currently on a 3-year waiting list to get a childcare place, there's a massive gap in care, but it's also not an either or. Like, I'm slightly hesitant about the juxtaposition. I agree from our analysis that care can produce more jobs, but I think both are essential for dealing with climate and public health and well-being. So I don't want to choose between people having warm homes and childcare, or cycle paths and care homes, or flood defences and hospitals. We clearly need all of those, but obviously partly for gender reasons and patriarchy, some of those don't get recognised as much as they need to be. So what makes good recovery stimulus? A key component is going to be quick job creation and speed, and what can be rolled out as quickly as possible, alongside also examining social, economic, environmental benefits. And you can look in the slides for the criteria that we used in examining different types of projects. But that quick job creation element is absolutely key, given the scale of the crisis we're facing. When we examined, and we didn't start from the position of, as I said before, let's look at the green things. We looked at a range of different types of projects, including road building, for example. And then we examined, well, which projects turned out to be best. And it did seem that the best projects for jobs, as well as the other criteria, tended to be the green ones. But not every green project created lots of quick jobs. So for instance, we wanted to include a program of rolling out solar panels on public buildings, but actually job creation through that isn't that significant. Or for example, we will need a national water transfer network over the next 15 years because of increasing droughts from climate change. That's going to be essential, but that's going to take years of planning. That's not something that's going to solve the immediate term jobs crisis. Things that did come out really well, and the TUC published UK version showed potential to create 1.24 million jobs in the immediate coming 2 years. So it's 1.24 million jobs over running for 2 years. Key elements there would be retrofitting homes, particularly social homes, and it would be possible to retrofit 40% of the UK's social homes in that time period. Providing cycle lanes and pedestrianisation to improve air quality across 50% of towns and cities, urban communities across the UK. Also offering, putting in place electric vehicle charging in rural areas where public transport is more limited for 50% of rural businesses. Accelerating social home construction to reach 100,000 homes a year, which is what, Shelter actually are calling for 150,000 homes, but it doesn't seem feasible to reach that target within the coming year. While also nature restoration measures such as expanding forests by 15% in the coming years, as well as a bunch of measures on how to increase clean manufacturing, such as, for example, in offshore wind, where at the moment there's loads of offshore wind gets built. The UK has more built than any other country, but most of the jobs are not taking place in the UK. And part of that is because when you look at who owns the offshore wind, tends to be public companies, but they're Norwegian, German, Danish, and Sweden. There's one offshore wind turbine, not farm, turbine in the UK that is partially publicly owned. And that's partly why we just don't have the jobs here of people making and assembling and putting together the bits. Now, that scale of program is also key. It's also about scale. And that's what we're not seeing from the government at the moment. Like, they're not giving the speed, they're not giving the targeted types of jobs, so will actually reduce inequality, but it is possible to make sure the program would be creating necessary jobs in held back regions, jobs that don't, this modeling that we did for TUC showed that the 1.24 million jobs could be primarily jobs that don't require degrees, that are available to younger people that do offer onwards training and that are in held back regions. Now, in comparison, the government has done their flagship green recovery program, the green homes vouchers. It's £2 billion out of, and they've got £3 billion, but £1 billion is for public buildings, £2 billion for green homes, domestic homes. Those are vouchers. So if you own a home, you can get the voucher, and then that will cover 2/3 of the cost. You add another 50% yourself to insulate, put in a bit of insulation, put in a couple double glazed windows. And, you know, it got Harold, the media jumped all over it. Some green groups were like, woo, this is great. And I mean, it was bigger than something we've seen recently, but then that's because what we've seen recently is zilch. And this is ever so a bit bigger. But if we keep on that track, at that rate of deployment that the government are saying, this is amazing, it would take 40 years from now to reach all homes in the UK, 40 years. So that means till 2060, which is 10 years after we're meant to hit net zero. Now, the average level of investment that the government modelled at that speed was putting in £4,200 per home. That will get you a couple windows, but it will not get your home anywhere near net zero. It won't, to even reach an EPC level C. At that level, you're still burning fossil fuels significantly. To get to EPC level C, we need an average investment of more like £10,000. So that means you get 600,000 homes putting in a couple windows, and then you've got to go back to those same homes in a couple of years. So it'll take 40 years, and actually we'll have to redo it all again within the next decade. It also fails on inequality, because for a start, it's targeting people who own their homes. So it's targeting people who have more assets, less assets. There's a 50 million, as in tiny, program for social homes. It also fails on inequality because it doesn't target held back regions. And it fails on jobs because the government estimate, and it seems from our modeling that they're overestimating it, that would create possibly up to 100,000 jobs, which we know in the scale of the unemployment that we're facing, that just doesn't do the trick. Now, as I mentioned, some groups were like, yay, it's better than nothing, it gets us going. But I think we've got to be honest, in the face of both the devastating jobs crisis and in the face of the climate crisis, where we need action right now, we just can't settle for better than nothing. We need to be pushing for vision for a significant transformational change, especially at a point when a lot of people have been stuck at home. They've had to change their lives. And a lot of people going, well, we want something different. We want something better. We want our own lives and our collective life to be better and different, and that the whole building back better, yet to come out of this in a safer, more secure way. And I think
get you to wind up.
Great, I'll wind up then. I think what the government is doing is akin to painting, I guess, like painting the house, putting a bit of more paint on the outside at the same time as the foundations crumble away and the roof burns. And yeah, that's what they're actually doing. Okay, I'll stop.
Thank you, Mika. It's hard not to listen to you and just get really frustrated by the scale of what the government's doing. And like you said, it just doesn't make any sense on so many levels. It doesn't reach any of the targets that we need to reach. It doesn't create the amount of jobs that we need to create. It doesn't tackle inequality to the scale that's needed. One of the things that strikes me listening to all of our calls is that we can't say that we don't have the ideas or that we don't have the money. So what, the block is obviously political. James, I just want to come back to you. There was a question on what potentially is going to be the effect on wages and wealth for some of those people that have already, under 40s, that have already gone through the financial crisis and that recession, and obviously a decade of stagnating, if not falling wages, especially if you're in the public sector, and now this, and what you expect in terms of trends on that. And Geoff, you should chime in on that as well. And just, I guess, a question, James, you and I used to work together back at the New Economics Foundation not long after the financial crisis and austerity began. Well, what's your feeling? Do you feel like that could happen all over again, or do you think the Tories are going to do things different this time?
Okay, two things. God, I mean, it's quite hard to answer the question on what happens to those under the age of 40 without depressing everyone further. I mean, the evidence, broadly speaking, is that periods of unemployment early in somebody's career, so like you just left school, you've just left university, tends to have a detrimental impact on somebody's earnings throughout the rest of their entire life. So if you come into the labour market and there's a lot of employment, you are going to be worse off sort of permanently as a result of that on average. Now, the issue this time around is that I think we're in a sort of exceptional period for the economy because of the nature of this crisis. So you could say that it's hard to read off from what we've seen coming out of previous recessions and just copy it onto this one. But broadly speaking, it doesn't look good. And by the way, the experience, if you're a young worker over the last sort of decade or so, if you've just entered the labour market or you've already been in it a few years in the period since the financial crisis, your wages in real terms have fallen. You're far more likely to be in insecure work. You're more likely to be in 0 hours contracts. Almost everything looks quite bad. You're significantly less likely to own your home. You're likely to have much reduced net wealth as a result. You're more likely to be in debt. You're more likely to be in problem debt. So pretty well everything looks bad. And what's happening with this is that it looks even worse. We've seen a bit with the Kickstarter Kickstarter program, which is, as Faiza and others have said, is a sort of version of the Future Jobs Fund that was introduced after the crash last time around, 2008-9, by the Labour government, scrapped by the Conservative-led coalition, I think in 2012, no later than that, seems to have had some impact on the people participating in their future employment. The difficulty this time around is that the amount they're actually going to pay people is significantly less. It doesn't really take account of the 10 years of inflation that's taken place. So there's a kind of sticking plaster that's being provided there. Nothing fundamental, nothing serious. Anneliese touched on some of the things you'd have to do if you were serious about that, which would include serious support for training, significantly more support for apprenticeships, keeping people in education, that sort of thing. Do I think we can hit austerity again? I mean, politically at this point in time, the Tories have been very keen to underline that they're not doing that. Boris Johnson himself has made a song and dance about this. There does appear to be something of a consensus, or at least a majority side of the Conservative Party recognise that just politically it's now very hard for them to do austerity, and the pressure to introduce it, the obvious sort of debt is rising, this is going to be disastrous, look at interest rates, that sort of rhetoric isn't quite there in the same way. Could it come back in? Yes, it could. More likely, I think it's going to come through around, well, some of the arguments around tax rises or even tax cuts, and therefore bring in austerity at some point in the future. But I do think we, particularly on the progressive end of the spectrum, I think we have to get a bit used to a world in which the Conservatives are not behaving like the Conservatives of 10 years ago. They are at least prepared to spend a bit of money. They are setting a floor on what they want to do at this point in time. They are going to try and invest a bit. They are going to intervene more than they have done in the past. I don't think this is just going to be a pure sort of free market conservatism. It's going to be inadequate, we know that, but it is going to be there. And some of the things we've seen, both of us have seen, Faiza, and everyone's seen the last sort of 10 years or so, I think won't play out in quite the same way. Perhaps they'll do a more sort of politicised austerity. I think the attempt to sort of blame cuts to Transport for London on the Mayor of London is an example of politicisation of austerity in a way that seems much sharper than we've seen in the last decade or so. So I think it's a different world. I think it looks particularly bad if you're young, but it doesn't look great for everyone, which is a happy note to conclude on. Great,
thanks for that, James. No, I know it's it has been really a difficult time, and you look ahead and it's hard not to feel that we're in for more difficulties. But I guess that point is true to some extent. The Tories are going to do bits and pieces, but it doesn't look like that's going to be at the scale, and they're not really taking care of inequality. So I feel like ultimately in a few years' time, things are still going to feel a lot worse, because when they need to be putting in £100, they're putting in £10, say, and actually the consequences going forward are going to really play out. And it really struck me listening to you about, more people in insecure work, younger people being really affected, that kind of economic situation that so many people find themselves. There are real political consequences for that. And that's where we get into the ways in which the Tories either use a culture war type approach, or we see people really standing up for themselves and demanding much more. Geoff, did you want to come in on just that point about what we're likely to see on wages, and
I mean, I don't disagree with what James has said. This is a different beast, but I do think one of the relevant factors might be the kind of mess the economy was in before the pandemic. You know, we had 10 years of austerity, but it wasn't just 10 years of austerity. It was 10 years of austerity on the back of a global financial crisis. And I think it's possible to argue that the global financial crisis was never really resolved. The central bank reserve creation sort of kicked the can, and the whole system was incredibly unstable. So that's my big fear when we come out of the pandemic. That sort of kicks in, and that's not just it's not just lefty economists making that argument. There's plenty of bankers out there who were warning about corporate debt before the crisis. So so it could be likely that they have to do a massive amount of intervention and a massive amount of reform. And it seems unlikely that Conservative Party will have the appetite for that kind of large-scale reform that the system needs. So in the end, I end up finding that sort of hopeful in a sort of roundabout kind of a way, because it does mean it's still all to play for. There's no magic bullet that the Conservative Party can pull off. It's going to be a big mess, and they're going to need the sort of solutions that the left want and the left campaign for.
See, I know you're desperate to come in. Give us your opinion.
I just think on the austerity question, and I think what the Tories will do is a very selective form of levelling up. So there's some inequality that concerns them, and some that doesn't at all. And so in many ways, they will reproduce the existing hierarchies and presumably make them worse as a result of that. And I think in a way that's the same with austerity. There's some bits of austerity they didn't like, and there's a lot that they're perfectly happy with and will probably intensify. So I just wouldn't believe so much the rhetoric about, this is an end to austerity. I just think it'll be more selective, more targeted, in some ways more pernicious, therefore.
Okay, so just to round up, thank you, James. I know James has to go. Thank you for joining us. Just as a kind of final 1 minute from you all, and I'll start with you, Mika. I guess we have at class, we have a lot of trade union activists and everyday people that are at this point just don't know what to do, don't know where to invest their energies, and how they feel like us, like there's all these great ideas and we've got all of this great plan, but it's frustrating because we just don't, we're not seeing it happen. Where would you want them to put their energies? Is there things that they can do right now, apart from join the trade union, of course, that would help in promoting some of these ideas and really bringing about the systemic and large-scale economic change that we need to have? Sorry, Mika, I know that's really harsh.
Yeah. I don't think there's any one thing that will get us to the systemic and transformational economic change quickly. And I also don't think I've got the answers. But I think it's key. I guess there's a bunch of different things. I think we shouldn't give up on the Labour Party, because I know many people are giving up on the Labour Party right now. So I guess if there's 57 participants watching in the Zoom chat still, my guess is that at least some of them will be thinking about ditching their membership. So I think it's probably worth not doing that, because we need a strong Labour Party that is prepared to call out and put a different vision forward at this point in time. And one of the lessons to learn from the 2008 financial crisis is that we need a main opposition party that isn't running on an austerity light platform, and that is saying, here's a bold alternative. And I think the second part of my answer is to be involved in other grassroots organizing as well at the same time, that fights for those bold visions, because it's easy. Well, it's not easy. It's hard to keep running with bold visions when we're facing the grinding down that the government is doing and will continue to do, when it's hard to believe that transformational change is really possible, but when we don't say, actually, we need this, then we end up saying we need this, and then that makes it ever so easy for the government to give us that. That's my, yeah.
Thanks, Mika, that's helpful. Sue?
I would actually agree with what Mika's just said, but I would add something particular to it, which is I think it's really important for people of different generations to get together. And one of the effects of the pandemic has been in some of the local organising that people are no longer living so much with just people very similar to themselves. And I think in recognising some of the real problems that of lack of public services, for example, will come out of that. How that gets transformed into was taking some of that energy towards the Labour Party. I don't know where it will go now, but it would be very nice if some of that remained and got used to some more positive direction, but in a more cross-generational way.
And Geoff?
Hi, well, thank you again for a stimulating discussion. I mean, I'm a trade unionist, so obviously I'm going to say, you know, join the trade union. But I'm also a macroeconomist, and I want a decent macroeconomic debate. I get incredibly vexed, and I find it profoundly disturbing how there are certain institutions. I mean, we've named one of them in a favourable light earlier, but the Institute for Fiscal Studies, but also the Office for Budget Responsibility, how these institutions dominate public discourse, and how this sort of the domination of the economics translates into the BBC and things like that, the sort of the media interviews that are continuously worrying, you know, at what point are we going to start to pay this back? I'm pretty certain that this discourse is wrong, and it's dangerous. So I think we need to get our ducks in a row about how we do this. And I think one of the ducks that we must get in a row is that we have to stop using the austerity framework. You know, I find Sue's argument for social care utterly compelling, but there's a part of me that wonders why she wants to make the argument through the supply side. You know, James wants to talk about raising taxes on wealth when the immediate concern is immediate spending. You know, even arguments about low rates of interest, or even MMT arguments about higher debt indefinitely, are all stuck in this household framework. You know, I'm a demand zealot, but you know that's always the trade union position, because if you pay people more, they go and spend more, and that supports the private sector. You know, that's the position since year dot, and which is why I find the Attlee government so interesting, because they were making this kind of argument that just make the economy what you want it to be. You know, it doesn't have to be a great super duper machine that can compete with Germany and China or something. The economy is just the stuff that people do, and a way to exchange the stuff that people do. And if you look at the Attlee initiatives, they're not supply side initiatives in general. You know, there's the NHS, it's the arts, it was just spending on things that they decided that society should spend on. So that's basically the point. I think we need to argue amongst ourselves a bit more and try and get our ducks in a row a bit better.
Great, thank you. What a great ending. Thank you, Geoff. And I think, you know, that really rounds up as well and reminds people what class does. And we commonly do a economics boot camp where we talk to people about how to talk about the economy and break down the framing, the austerity framing. And we'll be hopefully doing that in September. But just a reminder to everyone as well is that we've got to keep having these conversations. There's already a progressive toolkit guide on the class website. Just don't be scared to look at some of the papers that Mika and Sue have put on the chat. So you'll have to remind me when the Women's Budget Group Commission paper is out. Is it September?
I'm not sure either.
I think it's September, October time. But to keep having those conversations with people around you, just keep changing their mindset. So when people around you say, like, oh, well, we're gonna have to pay all this money back, that you know what to say. Because in the absence of, you know, knocking on doors and maybe using the Labour Party in the way that we have in the last few years, we've got to take that on ourselves to have those arguments. And class is really about building those tools for our activist space to use. So please keep in touch with us and keep having a look at what we've got going, because we will be doing another economics boot camp, and to give people some of the tools to have these conversations. I think I'll leave it there, and just to say thank you to Sue and Mika and Geoff and to the other speakers that had to leave. And as things unravel and things happen, we will of course be convening more discussions like this, because like Geoff said, we need to be having these discussions, sorting out our arguments, and then going out and fighting for the change we want to see. So thank you so much. Good evening to you all. Take care. Bye.
Thanks, Faiza.
Thanks, Faiza.
Bye.
Thank you, Guess.